are coming back to the book of Hebrews. We are nearing the end of the book, and this is quite a challenging passage. The passage will make a lot more sense if you think about the way that it connects to the previous passage. The previous passage talks all about holiness. It's a massive call to holiness after he has looked at the heroes of the faith in chapter 11. When he comes to chapter 12, what we'll see here is that he talks about ways in which people of the Bible relate to God in a way to try and achieve this holiness. And we'll see that there's an Old Testament or Old Covenant and a New Covenant way of doing this. So when he comes to chapter 12, verse 18 to 29, he points to his hearers, the author of Hebrews, and he starts saying, remember that there are two ways. One way you are tempted to go back to, a second way that he has always been calling them to, and that is the new way, the new covenant way introduced to us by Christ. So let's have a look at how this passage is structured, which will help us to get the meaning behind what the author is saying. Now, the first kind of things that we want to highlight is to say, what are the things that characterizes the first mountain? He says, you have not come to a mountain, and then he lists a whole bunch of characteristics. So it cannot be touched. It is burning with fire. There's darkness, gloom, and storm. There's a trumpet blast, which always indicated God's arrival in awe and majesty. There's a voice speaking, but when this voice speaks, it speaks in such a way that those who heard it begged for it not to carry on. It is not a pleasant voice to listen to. They couldn't bear what it was commanding. Whoever touched the mountain must be put to death. It's a terrifying sight. It's a terrifying sight even for Moses, who was God's mediator of that covenant. He was trembling with fear. So all of this paints a picture that the author of Hebrews is trying to contrast, and we'll see how that works. So this is where all of those characteristics end, and it forms a meaning block that tells us that Mount Sinai is a place of where God is. That is, we must keep that in mind. It is the same God, Old Covenant and New Covenant. The difference is how people can relate to him because of the different mediator. And we'll see how that is highlighted. The mediator here is Moses. The Mount Sinai is a place of absolute fear and separation from God, even though there's a mediator, and the mediator's job is simply to relay God's words. We have a conjunction in verse 22. This conjunction is but, and it is a contrastive conjunction. It just means that it really indicates a big change in theme. So the theme now changes obviously to Mount Zion. And here are some descriptives about Mount Zion. What it doesn't do is it doesn't give you all the kind of descriptions that it has in the first section, where it describes Sinai. It does tell us that it's the heavenly Jerusalem, so now he's not looking backwards, he's looking forwards. And the biggest, and maybe the only, descriptive word about this Mount Zion is that it's a joyful assembly. Now, joyful assembly is a very far cry from what has happened at Mount Sinai, where there was fear and separation, and people terrifying and trembling with fear. So the main characteristic, the main way in which people relate to God in this Mount Zion will be as a joyful assembly. It's the same God. Something has happened in between that changes the way that people relate to God in a massive way. So who makes up this joyful assembly? Well, in verse 23 it says that it's the church of the firstborn, and according to commentators that refers to the firstborn is Jesus Christ. Right? So it's anybody who believes in Christ, any New Testament believers, including you and me. It is, you have come to God. God is there. It's the same God, the one who's going to judge. But it also includes the spirits of the righteous made perfect. Now again, according to commentators, that is slightly unclear, but the majority of people believe that those are people who believed and have been made righteous before Christ has come. All the believers in the Old Testament times that have been faithful to God and whose blood Christ has forgiven sort of backwards into history. They've also come at this point to Jesus. This is the second major change. The mediator is not Moses, it is Jesus, and he's the mediator of the new covenant. So the two mountains represents two different covenants. Sinai is the old covenant, Zion is the new covenant. And it speaks to sprinkling of blood. Sprinkling of blood has always been a sign of how God has commanded people to make things holy. And in this case, instead of the blood of animals, it is Jesus Christ's blood. But it does speak of a strange thing. It speaks of a better word than the blood of Abel. And I think Hebrews 12 verse 24 is very much the key for me, the key differences, or that, how shall I put it? It is the key difference that to keep in mind, that indicates where the change lies between the old and the new covenant. Jesus the mediator and his blood that speaks a better word. The theme throughout Hebrews is that Jesus is greater than, Jesus is better. And here he uses the last of those pictures, saying it speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. And that comes from the story of Genesis 4. I'm not going to elaborate here, but the blood of Abel cried out for justice. It indicated that his brother Cain that killed him is guilty, where Jesus' blood speaks a better word. It says, you're not guilty, you are forgiven. Which is massive, which indicates obviously the reason for this whole new covenant. That is where the second meaning block ends. I'll show you why we say that in a minute. And the second meaning block speaks all about Mount Zion, the joyful assembly, and Jesus as the mediator. Why we say it ends at verse 24 is because verse 25 starts with a command. The moment that it changes from a description of the new Mount Zion in verse 24, it jumps to a command. And when we see that command, we know we are busy with a new meaning block, a new idea that the author is wanting to tell his audience. What must they do? They must see to it, they must do something together. They must not refuse him who speaks. Now, him who speaks, since chapter 1, verse 1 of Hebrews, him who speaks has always been God. God has been speaking to our ancestors in many ways and in many forms. And now he has spoken through Christ. So it's always God speaking. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, that it refers back to this Sinai speaking, where there was a voice when God came down to earth, on earth. Also, it can refer to when Jesus spoke on earth. But most commentators think that this reference, him who warned them on earth, refers back to the Sinai speaking. Then he contrasted how much less will we, if we turn away from him who warned us from heaven. Who is he who is now in heaven? It is Jesus Christ. when Jesus Christ now speaks from heaven, and we'll see what he is saying in a minute. Him who warns us from heaven, that's also God. Well, to be more specific, we think that is Christ speaking. At that time, his voice, again, is not a tame voice, even though it's the new covenant. It will shake. It shook the earth at Sinai. It will, at the end of the age, will speak again of judgment, and it will shake the earth again. It is the same God. This God is a consuming fire. He is the one speaking. So when he does speak, it has a very particular effect. It shakes. It shakes things up. It breaks things apart. And in this, the point that the author here wants to make is it shakes earthly things. It shakes things that are temporary, so that, and in order that, only those things that cannot be shaken is left. It shakes things that can be shaken. It shakes things that cannot be shaken. But only those things that cannot be shaken will remain. Those things that are holy. Those things that are part of the new Zion. It cannot be shaken. You will receive a kingdom that cannot be shaken. After the earth is not our kingdom. The earth is not our home. We as believers will receive a new kingdom. Therefore, see to it that we listen to his words, that we don't refuse his words. These are the warnings that the author of Hebrews has been warning his people about since chapter 1, verse 1. So the last meaning block speaks about this big warning, not to refuse God's words, but to live in thankfulness and in joyfulness, because what a massive promise that we will receive a kingdom that cannot be shaken. That is something that is true for us today already. He says you are already citizens. You are already part of it. You are, in verse 23, he says the church of the firstborn. That is who is going to be there. We already have that citizenship. We just wait for it to become a reality. And we can live, and now we can relate to God in a different way. We relate to God in thankfulness and in reverence and awe. He is still a consuming fire, but we certainly are not afraid. The fear has been taken away because of Christ, the mediator's new blood, what he has done for us on the cross, and the new covenant, which speaks a much better word. I hope that is helpful. May you ponder on this, and may you be greatly encouraged as you work through Hebrews and Hebrews 12, verse 18 to 29.